Ian pulled down his hood and noticed Damien seemed troubled, ending the conversation so abruptly without explanation. Ian knew inexperienced cadets had little chance of survival in the mountains, while high-ranking cadets' nobles' children would be protected by instructors. Then, a sudden shout ordered everyone to clear the way. Ian noticed Lorna walking past, and all cadets stepped aside for her. The higher-ranking ones told the lower-ranking cadets to move, and Ian cursed under his breath, realizing he was too close. He pulled his hood back over his head, aware that Lorna was regarded almost like an idol here. When she drew level with him, he turned his head away, silently willing her to pass without stopping. She did not stop, but when she reached him, her gaze fixed briefly on him, and she told him to remain calm. Ian lowered his head, slightly disappointed that she had noticed him. Still, since she moved on without lingering, it was not as bad as he feared. He reminded himself there was no point in worrying about her soon. He would escape this place. Walking toward Roman, Ian caught his attention and asked if he had done what was requested. Roman hesitated slightly, then said everything was ready. Ian was satisfied and told him to take a good look at the great stone sword while he could. Roman asked why he should bother looking at such a monstrosity. Ian replied that he wouldn't see it tomorrow. Roman frowned tiredly, staring at him in disbelief. Remembering Damien's irritated expression, Ian mentally noted that he knew the chief instructor's orders. Before the first exam, he was to personally visit the imperial palace to inform the emperor that the test would be held. Damon disliked visiting the ruler, but he could not disobey the order. With that, one of the main problems in their plan disappeared. Imagining the bloody flag, Ian thought they would escape tonight and frowned in concentration. Some time later, using a torch to light his way, the instructor walked down the corridor, calling out Cadet 920's number. The cadet replied that he was present, and the warden continued past the bars, noting that 9301 had died earlier that day. He then called for 956, who answered, confirming his presence. Pleased, the instructor called for 974 to respond. When no answer came, he looked sharply toward the bars, asking if Jan was playing games again. He ordered him to respond immediately, calling his number and name repeatedly. Finally, Jan emerged from the darkness behind him, clasped his hands around the instructor's head, and twisted sharply, snapping his neck. Without hesitation, Jan ordered everyone to get to work. Ian, Roman, and two other cadets, Jake and Todd, began their escape from the Special Forces Training Center. Glancing at the dead overseer, one of them, noting the upcoming guard change, ordered the others to hide the body to avoid detection. Jake and Todd quickly began dragging the corpse away, promising to be swift. As they worked, Roman approached Ian and mentioned that he had brought the two cadets as requested. Ian asked if their skills could be trusted. Roman assured him they could, but inquired if it was true Ian wouldn't be using them as bait. If that was the case, Roman suggested they might be safer staying at the academy. At that moment, Jake and Todd rejoined them, assuring Ian they wouldn't be a burden since they too faced the risk of death. Ian agreed and told them to remain quiet, not wanting to wake the light sleepers. After they had walked some distance, Ian stopped and pointed ahead. They stood before massive gates. He explained that this was precisely why he needed them. He couldn't open the gates alone. The others, puzzled, asked again for clarification. Ian elaborated. To get from the barracks to the abandoned toilet in a closed-off area, they had to open a double gate. He showed them a diagram of a corridor, 2 rooms, and the gate. In order for the doors to swing open, 2 people needed to stand on pressure plates, while on the other side of the second gate, a lever had to be pulled down. First, 2 people would step on the plates to open the first gate. The other 2 would pass through, pull the lever at the second gate, and open the first gate from that side. Then the remaining 2 would follow. That was why Ian could never escape alone. Roman said he understood, then turned to Jake and asked if he was ready. He instructed that they step on the plates as soon as he gave the signal. Jake agreed. At Roman's command, they stepped onto the plates simultaneously, and the gate began to open. The group cheered at the sight. Walking into the open corridor, Ian ordered Roman and Jake to remain in place. Todd called after him before he got far, but Roman asked Ian to wait and questioned how long they would need to stand there. Without turning back, Ian replied that they should stay until he gave the signal. After some time, Roman, realizing more time had passed than expected, cautiously asked why Ian and Todd hadn't returned. Suddenly, loud noises echoed through the air, and the gate slammed shut. Seeing this, Roman ran to the doors, pounding his fists against them and shouting Ian's name while hurling insults. He cursed himself for not realizing earlier he should have guessed when Ian insisted on going first. Hearing the shouts, Ian smirked and called out, asking if Roman was blind. Roman froze, frowning as he processed the voice. Was that Yang speaking? The gates began to open slowly, revealing the protagonist's silhouette in the gap. He remarked that he was certain he had told them to wait for his signal, but Roman hadn't even managed that. Wiping the blood from his cheek, he asked with clear displeasure who had abandoned whom. Ignoring the question, Roman instead asked whose blood it was, curious about what had happened inside. He also wondered where Todd was. Yan replied that both he and Todd were fine, assuring Roman that his concern was unnecessary. He explained they had been delayed by an unexpected variable. As they walked down the hallway, Roman, picking up on the mention of this variable, pressed for clarification. The protagonist admitted he had assumed he could simply drug the bait, but that plan had failed. By then, they had reached another gate. Roman froze in shock, crying out at the sight of a massive wolf's corpse lying in a pool of blood. Approaching the beast, Ian admitted it had been far more vicious than expected, which was why it had taken so long. Roman marveled at its size, asking if the protagonist had killed it alone. Ian simply urged that they not linger and that they run as soon as possible. Their escape went smoothly after that. Through a tunnel Ian had dug in an abandoned restroom, the four cadets slipped beyond the training center's walls. Emerging onto a slope overlooking the forest, they finally broke through to the outside. The protagonist, who climbed out first, surveyed their surroundings and said he believed they had succeeded. Roman, the last to emerge, called for Todd and Jake to pull him up. Ian, stepping to the edge of the slope, noted there was no sign of pursuit yet, but the guards had likely already discovered their escape. Roman joined him, remarking with mild disappointment that it had been too easy. The protagonist, staring straight ahead, disagreed, pointing out that their success had cost them both time and effort. Ian agreed and added that he hadn't breathed fresh air in a long while. Jake and Todd soon joined them. Roman, arms crossed, asked whether they would stay or keep moving. Ian, still looking into the distance, advised them to stay vigilant, as their ordeal was only beginning. Looking down, he silently confirmed that truth to himself. He drew out a pendant, opened it, and gazed at the photograph inside. This, he thought, was the beginning of the journey to reclaim his life. Looking to the sky, he repeated that it all started now. Some time later, they decided to review the plan. With time running short, Ian announced he would explain it only once and told the others to listen carefully. He described the great forest of Atrian, composed of ancient sia trees, nestled within the empire's northern mountains. At present, they were deep within its heart, and it would take 2 days of running to get clear. He spread a rough map on the ground, placing several cut-out figures to represent them. Roman, arms crossed, interrupted to ask why they couldn't simply hide in the deepest part of the forest. He pointed out that the sia were tall trees with wide trunks, offering plenty of cover if they hid properly. The protagonist explained that areas with the best hiding spots were also where the most monsters dwelled. Roman, distracted from the explanation, asked when Ian had even had time to make a map and figures. Ian ignored the question, stating that they were likely already being pursued, and it was only a matter of time before they were caught. The pursuing squad numbered around 20. Once they closed in, it would be over. The only way to improve their odds was to split up, forcing the pursuers to divide as well. If they scattered in different directions, each guard team would shrink, leaving about 5 per cadet. This, Ian reasoned, would significantly improve each person's chances of escape. Roman clenched his jaw, frowning. "You're joking," he said, realizing that he would inevitably become the bait since they would target the cadet with the highest number first. The protagonist looked at him with irritation, remarking that Roman didn't need to train so excessively and asking who had even told him to do so. He also wondered aloud if Roman was dissatisfied with something. Soon, he returned to discussing the details of the plan, noting that if they stayed together the entire time, they would almost certainly be killed. At least one of them, however, should be able to escape successfully. Jake and Todd exchanged serious glances. Ian frowned and declared that they should all scatter in different directions, asking if there were any further questions. Roman asked him to wait, admitting that he didn't understand something. Focusing on the map, he noticed that each figure had a number written on it except for the one representing himself, which bore the word fool. He wanted to know why. The protagonist, however, offered no explanation and simply stated that if there were no more questions, it was time to leave. Roman tried to stop him, reminding him that he hadn't answered, but Ian suddenly became distracted as Jake called out to him. Jake thanked him sincerely, saying he was certain that without Ian, they never would have made it out alive. Removing his hood, Jake promised that he would definitely repay the favor and remarked that in the future, they might no longer have to pretend they didn't know each other. The protagonist studied him intently. He had considered Jake to be just an ordinary cadet, but now suspected he must have had a very good reason to risk his life in such a way. Interrupting, Roman commented dryly that the whole thing was amusing and expressed the hope that he would never see them again. Ian called him by name, acknowledging that he was a skilled cadet, but also a heartless person. Frowning, Roman indignantly shouted that it wasn't true. Covering his mouth to calm himself, he explained that they would only meet again if they were all captured, and if they never saw one another again, it would mean the escape had been successful. The protagonist regarded him thoughtfully, noting that sometimes he spoke like an old man. He even asked himself whether Roman had somehow regressed. Catching his odd look, Roman stared back in confusion. At last, Ian admitted that Roman was right and wished that they would never meet again. They exchanged one last look, and some time later, they were sprinting through the forest. The main character ran forward with intense focus, assuming the others were also moving at full speed. Deciding it was time for him to do the same, he inhaled deeply. He activated the breath of the divine dragon, combining it with his acceleration technique and channeling magic into his legs, increasing both strength and speed. Once he had gathered the necessary magical energy, Ian invoked the wings of the wind bird, gaining even more momentum. In an instant, he scaled the top of a tall tree. Pausing to scan the surroundings, he reflected that the body's physical limitations remained his greatest obstacle. It was difficult to even maintain the breath of the dragon. His veins still could not conduct enough mana, though he was glad he had managed to improve his own abilities. He had no idea how the others were faring. The thought of Roman made him smile faintly, before admitting to himself that he, too, was in a pitiful state. Once, he had been the 5th captain of the special squad, a master of assassination, pursuit, and surveillance. He decided to test whether any of his past life skills had carried over and grinned with a predator's edge. Meanwhile, elsewhere, one of the instructors asked his comrade if there had been any news from the pursuit squad. The other man replied that they had not yet returned. Summoning the other workers, the instructor demanded to know why the loss had been discovered so late. He insisted they catch the fugitives immediately, warning that if the head instructor, whom he derisively called an idiot, returned from the palace, it would spell trouble. His comrade agreed, stressing that the deserters must be apprehended at once. Before he arrived, someone suddenly announced that they would not be able to proceed. At that moment, Damon appeared silently behind one of the instructors. Placing a firm hand on the man's shoulder, he leaned closer, closed his eyes, and addressed him by the very name the instructor had just used for him. Calmly, he declared that he had already returned. The man turned toward him in horror, struggling to justify himself. His emotions overwhelmed him, and he could not form coherent sentences. Opening his eyes, Damon smiled faintly, then stepped back, patting the man's shoulder. He remarked that there was nothing terrible in this, that such things happen to everyone, and advised him to relax. The instructor, now flustered, apologized, admitting that he had spoken faster than he had thought. Maintaining a friendly demeanor, Damon asked if it was true that people sometimes cursed even the emperor when he was not present. Meanwhile, his two assistants subtly blocked the path of a second instructor. Damon, still holding the first man's shoulder, walked a short distance with him and asked if it was true that he was in charge of the cadet barracks. He added that the man must be exhausted from trying to track the fugitives. The instructor stammered, denying the claim, and urged Damon not to worry, insisting that the pursuit squad would capture the fugitives without any problems. Closing his eyes again, Damon smiled and asked how exactly they would manage that. The man, confused, asked him to repeat himself. Damon's expression darkened into a furious frown as he told him that there were already problems. In an instant, he pressed down sharply on the instructor's shoulder. The man's eyes went wide as he collapsed to the ground with such force that the bones in his legs snapped. Blood sprayed into the air as he screamed in agony, shouting about his injury. Watching him calmly, Damon remarked that the instructor had not even known the cadets were planning an escape, had not suspected they were digging a tunnel, and had not noticed that they had stolen supplies. The man, struggling to rise, pleaded for forgiveness and begged for another chance. Damon placed his foot on the man's head, pressing it into the ground, and asked if he truly believed he could be granted another chance. The instructor clenched his jaw but did not resist. Staring at him with a menacing gaze, Damon told him there was no chance to give. Pressing harder, blood streamed down the man's face as he cried out for mercy. Damon continued, pointing out that the instructor had not even sensed who was standing behind him. Despite the desperate pleas, Damon finished him off. More blood splattered across the ground. Closing his eyes, Damon stepped aside and ordered his assistants to call off the pursuit squad. They immediately complied. Leaving bloody footprints behind, he stated that he would be taking command personally. His assistants expressed surprise, but Damon smiled and confirmed it, explaining that he had found something intriguing and could not restrain himself. Meanwhile, in the great forest of Atrian, the special pursuit squad of Team Number 3 raced through the trees after the deserters. Suddenly, Kelly sensed something amiss. He stopped abruptly, raising his hand to signal the others to halt. They obeyed but looked to him in confusion. One pursuer suggested they had lost the trail, but Kelly, removing his mask, assured them that everything was proceeding smoothly. Still, he asked if they didn't find it odd that things were going so smoothly and what they made of it. The leader of Team Number 3 glanced at his teammates, Jael and Andre. Andre pointed out that the cadet in question was only number 974, so naturally the chase would be easy. Jael accused Kelly of once again being overly suspicious. He reminded him that they had followed tracks leading away from the cliff and then found Prince heading in that same direction. In his view, Ian was simply in a hurry to escape, and Jael continued to develop this line of reasoning. Andre asked if Kelly's constant suspicion was the reason his partners always abandoned him. He added that this behavior had already become an illness. Kelly glared at them in anger, then lowered his head and questioned himself, wondering if the problem truly lay within him. Still unable to calm down, he noticed the fog beginning to lift and decided they needed to capture the fugitive before he escaped. Jael and Andre agreed, with Andre adding that since they were squad number 974, they would handle it quickly. He remarked that the team pursuing number 12 must be struggling at that very moment. Jael reminded him that although number 12 was a cadet, he would soon be captured by another squad. Andre countered, saying Jael was far too confident. Tilting his head slightly, He asked what JL's number had been in the training center. Suddenly, Jan appeared from above, hanging from a tree branch. Without warning, he grabbed Andre and pulled him into the leaves, silencing him before he could even scream. The main character realized he had only 2 pursuers left. JL tried to answer Andre's question about his number, but then noticed with confusion that Andre, who had been walking beside him, had vanished. Calling out in shock, JL failed to notice Jan emerging from behind a tree trunk. With a swift motion, Jan slashed his dagger, hiding JL's body in the grass. Only one enemy remained. Kelly, irritated by the noise, warned that they weren't on a picnic and that Jan would flee if he heard them. But when he turned around, he realized that both JL and Andre were gone. Stunned, he called their names in disbelief, horrified that his squad mates had disappeared without a trace in such a short time. The unease he had felt now made sense, but he refused to believe it was possible. Even if they had been pursuing number 12, a cadet could never defeat members of the Special Forces. He struggled to comprehend how cadet number 974 could have managed it. As he thought, Jan appeared silently behind him, reaching out with his arms. Kelly, regaining his composure, quickly turned and launched a spinning strike to distract him. The protagonist reacted in time, dodging, so the attack instead shattered a tree behind him. Furious, Kelly called him impudent, demanding if he thought the same trick would work a 3rd time. Suddenly, a thin line tightened around Kelly's throat, yanking him back. He screamed, trying to claw at it as his weapon fell from his grasp. Shocked, he realized it was a line. Thrown over a tree branch, it pulled his body upward while cutting deeper into his neck. Gritting his teeth, Kelly tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound. He remembered the footprints and scraps of clothing they had followed and realized too late that they had been bait. Certain that Cadet 974 could not have defeated the pursuit squad, he desperately called out to Andre and JL, but nothing answered. His body weakened, trembling one last time before collapsing. From the shadows, Jan tightened his grip on the fishing line with focused concentration until Kelly finally gave in. With the number 3 pursuit squad eliminated, Jan picked up a dagger dropped by one of them. He examined it and concluded it was a good weapon, especially for throwing. Climbing onto a branch for safety, he reflected that pulling off such an attack was easier than expected. With body-strengthening techniques, he thought, encounters like this would not be difficult. Still, he knew he needed to escape the forest before the fog descended again. Bloodstains were everywhere, and the hounds would soon catch the scent. To cover his trail, he decided to mask his body's odor using salam grass. He plucked a few leaves, chewing them despite their extreme bitterness. The berries of salam grass were poisonous, and its leaves emitted a foul stench. Crushing the leaves into a paste, he smeared it over his body. Though the smell was revolting, he consoled himself that it would not be in vain. Since the dogs could not bear the stench of the slain, they were unable to pick up Ian's scent. Thanks to this, his pursuers would not find him. Realizing that time was running out, he decided it was time to move quickly. Even in the farthest corners of the empire, he would not be able to hide if snares were spread across the skies and nets laid upon the earth. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted. Looking into the distance, he noticed smoke rising. Straightening up on the branch, he immediately realized the troops would never start a fire. The only people who could be there were Jake or Todd. He muttered to himself, calling them idiots, and wondered if they thought this was just some casual hike. He knew the consequences if the fire wasn't put out, but he closed his eyes and lowered his head, refusing to dwell on it. Now was not the time to worry about others. After all, he had already taken the rest of the team with him to use as bait. If they drew attention to themselves, all the better for him. He recalled the moment they leaned toward each other, exchanging glances, and once again called his comrades fools. Then, jumping down from the tree, he began running, frowning as he considered whether it might actually be useful if they survived. Strengthening his body with magic, Ian reminded himself that he needed to extinguish the fire before their pursuers noticed. But suddenly, he froze. A chill ran down the back of his neck, and his eyes widened. He recognized it immediately, the deathly gaze that had haunted him so many times on the battlefield. Something was standing behind him, watching. It felt as though a snake was coiling around him, tightening its grip. The phantom serpent opened its mouth, ready to strike. Then, a voice broke the silence, admitting with amusement that he was glad Ian had fallen for it. Turning around, Ian saw his observer, who continued speaking, saying that from the very beginning, he had known Ian was an interesting man. Ian thought to himself that even the flutter of a butterfly's wings could trigger a storm, and this man declared that he knew Ian would prove himself, and indeed, he had. Damien stood behind him, smiling with his eyes closed. He remarked that his instincts had not deceived him. Ian, however, only frowned and pressed his lips tightly, staring at him in silence. Damien stopped and introduced himself politely, saying he was pleased to meet him. For a moment, both of them remained wordless. Suddenly, lightning split the sky. Damien glanced upward and assumed it was about to pour. Ian remained silent, his thoughts racing. This couldn't be. Why was Damien here? Raising his hand over his face, Damien wondered aloud if the storm would be limited to just one bolt of lightning. Ian's mind went back to the past. He had confirmed before escaping that the instructor had gone to the Imperial Palace. There, Damien had reportedly been scolded so harshly he was nearly imprisoned. So why was he here now? The realization struck him like a hammer. Had the future gone astray? He pictured two splitting rails and asked himself if his own actions had altered the course of events. If so, which ones? He recalled his battles against Roman, his confrontation with Lauren, and the moment he had thrown the crystal mole. None of these should have affected Damien, yet he now realized that his reckless actions had created fractures that hadn't existed before his rebirth. Those cracks had already begun to shatter the future that was supposed to belong to him. Breaking Ian's train of thought, Damien suddenly asked what he would throw this time. Would it be the crystal mole? Or perhaps the electric mouse? Ian's frown deepened. Did Damien really notice that too? And more importantly, did he think Ian wouldn't realize he was being watched? He admitted that he was still impressed, as he hadn't expected Ian to organize an escape on such short notice. He noted how quickly the protagonist moved, confessing that at first he was shocked and didn't understand what had happened. But soon, Ian stood out to him immediately. He had thought only cockroaches lived here. Yet remembering how Ian drew his attention while standing among the cadets, he acknowledged that such an interesting specimen was among them and smiled slightly. Ian, meanwhile, cursed inwardly, realizing how reckless that act had been. He wasn't sure how much the future had already changed, but he knew it couldn't possibly be worse than this. Even then, he began to doubt that belief. Damon was known as one of the three swords of the continent, though his second name would come later. Thinking about this, Ian envisioned a bloody flag and swords buried in the earth, before snapping back to reality. Damon suddenly chuckled, calling Ian amusing, and burst into laughter, clapping his hands in delight as if nothing could be better. Ian stared at him seriously, but Damon only grinned wider, asking if Ian was already planning how to kill him. He admitted that it had been a long time since he'd felt this entertained and invited Ian to tell him his plan. He explained his joy by noting that most people in such situations only thought of running away, yet Ian was acting completely differently. Still laughing, Damon confessed that he was at a loss for words, covering his face with his hand as he sighed and tried to calm himself. Apologizing to Ian, he admitted he didn't even know how to stop. Finally, he grew serious. He declared that he would grant Ian a unique opportunity to try and kill him. If Ian succeeded, he would gain the freedom he longed for. Ian shuddered at these words, staring in shock, while Damon laughed inwardly. He found it amusing that the moment he said this, even Ian's gaze toward him changed. He had never encountered anyone like this before, a low-level cadet who could kill a hellish monster and destroy a pursuit team. Ian possessed prudence, courage, and endurance. He was on a completely different level compared to other scum. As he thought about this, Damon glanced at the two captured cadets tied up on the grass. He felt Ian seemed destined for a greater mission. He even imagined the Bone Man standing behind Ian, observing his progress, and wondered what kind of monster Ian would eventually become. In his mind, he saw Ian donning the instructor's mask. Ian suddenly sighed, preparing to act. Damon, noticing this, urged him mentally to show his skills. But instead of attacking, Ian dropped to his knees. The head instructor's attention snapped to him as Ian begged for his help. Damon froze in disbelief, unable to respond. Ian, feigning despair, asked if it was truly the head instructor before him. He claimed his eyesight was terrible, and that he couldn't even recognize who stood there. He shouted that he never intended to run, explaining that other cadets had captured him and threatened to kill him if he disobeyed. He said he thought it was over when they left him behind, but then Damon appeared. With a confused expression, Damon asked if Ian really meant to say the escape had been forced on him by the others. Ian insisted it was true, pitifully adding that the plan was organized by Cadet Number 12, who had been cursing Damon for days. He painted a twisted image of Roman, describing him as a vile villain who vowed to harm Damon, calling him a deranged and wicked man. Closing his eyes, Damon verbally agreed with Ian's claims, though inwardly he questioned if Ian truly believed such an act could fool him. Yet Ian didn't stop. Stammering, he turned to Damon, then burst into tears, no longer holding back. Realizing it was all a ploy, Damon sharply waved his hand and shouted that this was exactly what he expected. At that moment, he caught a thin blade Ian had hurled toward him, recognizing that Ian had tried to exploit his guard being down. Damon smiled, admitting it was a great disappointment. But then his eyes widened in shock. The second blade was already flying straight at his face, nearly piercing his eye. At the last moment, he managed to dodge with a scream, and the blade only slightly scratched his cheek. Frowning in amazement, Damon wondered if Ian had really thrown two knives along the same trajectory. He hadn't expected such a trick. Suddenly, noticing that the space in front of him was empty, he realized Ian had escaped. He asked if this was really Ian's plan, but the protagonist answered that it wasn't. Once in the air, Ian declared that this was exactly what he had wanted, and swung his arm, preparing to strike. Damon froze, then turned around and demanded to know when Ian had managed to do that. Clenching his jaw and frowning, Ian ignored him and activated the 15th form of the elusive Shadow, summoning Shadow to strengthen his attack. Flashes of magical energy appeared. Forced to jump back, the protagonist screamed, wondering if Damon had reflected his attack. Ian received a small wound himself. Straightening up, he stared at the enemy shrouded in magical energy and said it was impossible. He asked himself if Damon had truly sealed himself inside the black fog. Frowning, he ordered himself to move forward and charged into the vortex of dark energy. Using enhancements, he struck again and again, trying to destroy the barrier. Concentrating deeply, he realized that if Damon kept pursuing him, escape would be impossible. That was why he had to act more decisively. Placing his palm against the dagger's blade, he ran his hand along it, leaving a strip of light magical energy. He used the first form of Shadow Fifth Sense, activating the secret technique of absorbing darkness to destroy the fog Damon had cloaked himself with. But the dagger in his hand couldn't withstand the strain, and the blade cracked. Screaming, Ian staggered aside, staring at the intact barrier. Damon reminded him that he had promised to let him go only if he defeated him. Ian looked at him in bewilderment, but Damon dispersed the fog, apologized, and admitted he didn't want to lose such an interesting toy. His clothes were torn, and grinning, Damon exclaimed that Ian was a unique cockroach. Even if he had to play with only him for the rest of his life, he would never tire of it. Ian frowned, thinking Damon looked like he had been bitten by a mad dog. But then his eyes widened as he noticed the tattoo on Damon's shoulder that refused to open. Staring at the mark in shock, he remembered what had happened 22 hours before the escape. In the cadet barracks, where the corridors were fenced off with bars. The instructor announced that roll call was over, ordered everyone to sleep, and began to leave. Jan quietly said everything was ready for the escape, noting that this was his last night in that place. Clutching the pendant in his hand, he thought it would be good to get out quickly and return to his family. He knew nothing about them. His only clue was an old medallion. He promised his family they would soon be together. Looking at the photograph, he wished for a peaceful life with them. Suddenly, he gasped in surprise as part of the pendant cracked. Cursing, he cried out that it was his only clue. But then he noticed something behind the shard. Breaking away part of the top cover, he discovered an unusual pattern hidden inside. It looked like a family crest. The drawing was engraved on the back of the medallion. Ian wondered why it had been concealed. If his family had a crest, then he was not from commoners or slaves. Smiling, he realized this was a valuable clue. If he could find someone familiar with the symbol, he might be able to find his relatives. That was exactly what he thought, but now he asked himself why the same crest was engraved on the body of the chief instructor. Staring at the symbol again, he watched as Damon, still grinning, tore away his damaged clothing so it wouldn't get in the way. Ian, still deep in thought, asked himself why Damon was wearing his family's crest. Snapping him out of it, Damon threw the cloth aside and asked why Ian had stopped. Assuming he had given up, Damon sneered, while Ian couldn't shake the feeling that he had just seen his family's mark in the most unexpected place. The protagonist questioned if Damon was truly a member of his family, noticing that he showed no reaction. Damon, disappointed, remarked that the fun was just beginning. The protagonist continued to think, certain that something was not right. Suddenly, Damon declared there was no other choice. Finding himself next to Ian, who opened her eyes wide, he smiled and announced that he would die right now. The protagonist flinched but quickly pushed off the ground, launching his own attack before Damon could act. A bright flash of magical energy burst into the air. Ian jumped back, frowning, and asked if he had missed. Pressing his lips tightly, Damon stood there smiling calmly. He admitted that the attack was powerful, then cried out in admiration, asking where the protagonist had learned such moves. Excited, he added that he also wanted to show something. Dark clots of magical energy, created by the shadow sword Black Dagger, began to rise from the ground near his foot. These clots transformed into sharp spikes that crawled out from beneath the earth, not only near Damon, but also where Ian stood. Ian screamed and performed a backflip to avoid the spikes, narrowly escaping with only his clothes torn where they grazed him. The protagonist realized that the instructor was merely toying with him. Otherwise, he would have been unable to withstand the Black Dagger's attack. Retreating to a safer distance, he dropped to one knee, considering whether he could escape when Damon's guard was down. But if he fled, he would never learn why he bore the family symbol on his body. He resolved to uncover the truth about his family, convinced that Damon was somehow connected. At the same time, he reflected on a powerful uprising soon to begin on the continent, the Armenian Rebellion. This war would destroy more than 10 kingdoms and wipe out countless noble families. The rebellion scarred history itself, threatening even the imperial family. The ruler ultimately crushed the revolt with his great sword, executing its leaders and their kin. Then he burned the rest, a fire that raged for nearly a month. People would remember this time as the sunset of 20 days. The rebellion's leader had been the illegitimate child of the previous emperor. Though many rumors spread about the failed revolution, the truth was never revealed. The protagonist imagined a man chained to a pole, standing atop a pile of firewood. A torch thrown onto the branches ignited the blaze. No one truly knew the rebellion's cause, for all records were destroyed. Yet, those who remembered called its leader the Three Swords of the Continent, though he was more widely known as the chief instructor of the Warrior Training Center for the Special Squad. Suddenly, Damon noticed that Ian seemed distracted, lost in thought. The protagonist realized that if his family was tied to Damon and the Armenian Rebellion, his relatives could be destined to die in the coming conflict. Imagining a symbol of fire, he resolved to prevent it. Escape would have to wait. He needed to stay, earn the instructor's trust, and uncover the truth. He reasoned that Damon must believe Ian needed him. Watching Damon's calm expression, he admitted he was impressed by his skill, never expecting someone like him to pursue him personally. Damon was pleased to hear this. The protagonist added that the leader of the special squad was likely grateful for Damon's efforts and wanted to continue, saying he was sure Damon's contributions were highly valued. But before he could finish, Damon stepped closer, placed a hand on his face, and before Ian could even cry out in shock, hurled him into the air. With a furious shout, he flung him against a nearby tree. The force of the throw was so great that Ian broke through the tree and tumbled further before crashing to the ground. Coughing in pain, he struggled to move. Damon approached, grabbed him by the collar, and lifted him up. He admitted that he thought Ian was likable, but added coldly that he clearly had no idea how to watch his tongue. Lifting him off the ground, he asked Ian if he really wanted to end his life like this. The protagonist remarked that even an impudent tongue could sometimes say something useful. Damon suggested they put that to the test. Lowering his head, Ian said he knew the captain's weakness, one that could kill him. Frowning, Damon stared at him in shock, furiously demanding how he could know such a thing. Ian smirked, raised his head, and revealed that it was about the 52nd number in Simon's County. He explained that this was the captain's weak spot. Damon asked if that was really true. Hours later, in the training center, Damon adjusted his gloves and coat inside one of the rooms, noting that the clothes were a little tight. He hadn't thought he would need to ruin his own beloved uniform. Closing his eyes, he decided there was nothing to be done and began walking down the corridor. As he descended the stairs, his assistant spoke from behind, reporting the location of the 3 cadets. Remembering this, Damon coldly said he wanted them thrown into a mass grave, claiming he didn't have time to worry about bugs. His assistant replied that he understood. Before Damon could continue speaking, a man appeared before him, remarking that Damon pretended to be the busiest person while, in truth, he seemed to have far too much free time. It was Rodrigo Mayer. He called Damon a junior, making him frown in displeasure but remain silent. Rodrigo pressed further, accusing him of being lazy and demanding an explanation. Damon closed his eyes and lowered his head respectfully, addressing him as captain, since Rodrigo was indeed the captain of the first-rank special squad. Rodrigo narrowed his eyes, asking about the cadets' recent training. Stepping closer, Damon replied that they were working hard. Rodrigo was surprised by this answer, as he had heard otherwise. Damon countered, saying he had heard their cadets were even superior to the squad members. Rodrigo, offended, shouted that this was a lie. He insisted that graduates of the training center possessed monstrous abilities. Damon then asked if this meant the squad members were at fault and suggested that whoever supervised them should be punished. Rodrigo thanked him for the advice and promised to take it into account. Damon dismissed the gratitude, saying there was nothing to thank him for. Standing slightly aside, Damon's assistant suddenly noticed the air vibrating with mana. Even the columns in the room trembled. He was shocked, realizing that unprepared people would normally lose consciousness under such pressure. Finally, breaking the silence, Rodrigo mentioned that he had heard Damon ignored an imperial decree to appear at the palace. Damon explained that he had more important matters to attend to and didn't want to waste time on pretentious meetings. Rodrigo's eyes narrowed as he asked what could possibly be more important than fulfilling His Majesty's orders. He hinted at what Damon might be thinking, then paused, studying him with interest. Finally, Rodrigo asked if Damon really believed that the blue blood running through his veins would protect him. Damon frowned in displeasure. Rodrigo then suggested that the real reason he skipped the imperial reception was because the cadets had escaped, questioning what it meant if he couldn't even handle them. Interrupting, Damon told him not to worry. Rodrigo had misunderstood. Turning his back, he firmly stated that no one had escaped. Rodrigo, bewildered, asked again, insisting it couldn't be true. He tried to explain what he had heard, but Damon cut him off, questioning whether Rodrigo's age had weakened his hearing. He explained that the cadets had gone outside with their instructors to prepare for the exam. Then, abruptly changing the subject, he asked Rodrigo if he had noticed the growing number of cockroaches. Rodrigo, confused, asked what he meant. Damon coldly replied that if he ever saw a bug in the center, he would crush it under his boot just as he had done once before with one of the instructors. He noted with irritation that no matter how many cockroaches he killed, they continued to appear. Rodrigo looked at him in bewilderment, and he suddenly declared that he believed he had found a cockroach nest. Determined, he said he would destroy all the larvae. Finally, he announced that it was time for him to leave and wished Rodrigo safe travels. As he walked away with his assistant, he assumed he had managed to calm his emotions. Seeing the captain's confused look, he concluded that it was indeed time to begin preparing his funeral. After a short pause, he admitted that everything his assistant had told him was completely true. When asked if that was really the case, the man behind him reassured him not to worry so much. Removing his mask, he insisted he was not lying to his allies and promised that Damon would see the truth for himself soon. Damon turned and looked intently at Ian, who had been with them the entire time. Ian smiled and confirmed that everything he had shared was true. As he thought about abandoned Street No. 592 in Simon County, memories resurfaced. He had once lived there. He pictured the old houses and recalled that in that nearly deserted place, he had once called out to someone, asking them to open a window so he could show them something interesting. At the time, he had been just a small boy. Staring at the closed window, he said he had caught a very large rat and asked the person inside to take a look at how cute it was. He remembered that the street was hardly suitable for children, yet there he was. Receiving no reply, he asked again if the person was really not at home. He insisted they open the window, but still no response came. Finally, he wondered aloud if they truly were not there. Then, suddenly, he heard a voice call him a fool. Startled, he opened his eyes wider. In the present, recalling this memory, Ian thought carefully about what had really happened on that street. He remembered how the window finally opened and a girl looked out, asking who would ever want to see a rat. She smiled and teased that it would be better if he brought her a squirrel instead. Smiling at the memory, Ian explained that the captain's daughter had lived in that house. His companion thought about it for a moment, realizing the truth of the situation. Ian admitted that he had been friends with her as a child, and his interlocutor agreed. Ian stood with Damon in the chief instructor's office. While Damon rested his chin on his hand, Ian stood opposite him, hands clasped behind his back. He explained that since there had been very few children on that street, everyone knew one another. Closing his eyes, Damon asked if he understood correctly that the girl Ian had played with in his childhood was indeed the captain's daughter. Ian confirmed it was true. Damon was taken aback, realizing the significance of this revelation. Ian knew it sounded unbelievable, almost too far-fetched, but he was determined to make Damon believe. There was long-standing hostility between the captain of the Special Forces and the chief instructor. Damon had searched every corner of the county for Rodrigo's weakness, but had found nothing. Remembering the way Damon had reacted when Ian mentioned the captain's daughter, Ian knew that his words had struck a nerve. He decided he had to use this information. Damon remarked that it was strange even if Ian knew where the captain's daughter lived. He did not understand why that would be considered a weakness. Ian calmly stated that he had heard it personally. Puzzled, Damon asked for clarification. Ian then recalled a conversation with the girl who had once told him she would soon be leaving that place. He sat next to her by the rooftop window and asked why she suddenly looked so sad. Resting her head on her hands, she explained that dangerous people were trying to harm her father. They were searching for her in order to blackmail him. Her father had said it would be better for them to leave, and a few days later, she disappeared, taken away by people dressed in black. Only when Ian arrived did he realize they were soldiers of a special squad, and her father was the squad's captain. Hearing this, Damon froze for a moment, then smiled. He remarked that it was incredible how everything seemed to fit together. Ian had been friends with the captain's daughter, and now he also learned that Damon and Rodrigo had a strained relationship. Damon was searching for Rodrigo's weakness, and Ian knew exactly what that weakness was. He asked if such incredible coincidences could truly happen. Ian wondered aloud if Damon was under the protection of the goddess of luck. Damon demanded to know why he would think that, but before Ian could answer, a sudden flash of magical energy shot toward him. Ian narrowly dodged as Damon hurled an object infused with magic, driving it deep into the wall. Damon sneered, saying that rather than believing in lucky coincidences, it made more sense to assume Ian was the captain's spy. He smirked and asked if that wasn't more logical. Ian, wiping the blood from the scratch on his cheek, calmly replied that it was only natural for Damon to think that way after all. The coincidences were remarkable. He explained that he had pieced together bits of knowledge, his own childhood memories, the captain's attitude toward his family, the hierarchy within the special force, and even Damon and Rodrigo's feud. Like a puzzle, he had assembled this information for the sake of survival. If he truly were the captain's spy, as Damon suspected, he would never have risked his life to escape. Instead, he kept this knowledge as a backup in case his plan failed. Damon narrowed his eyes, studying him. Ian decided to weave truth with lies, planting both hope and doubt in the head instructor's heart. According to his reasoning, faith had to balance with suspicion, so that in the end, faith would prevail. He then revealed that he knew where the captain's daughter was now. Damon shuddered and stared intently at him. Ian pressed further, saying he would prove that trusting him was more profitable, forcing Damon to lean toward belief. Clenching his jaw, Damon stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street as the weight of Ian's words sank in. Ian watched him carefully, wondering if the balance had tipped. Damon turned back with a smile, asking if the goddess of luck truly favored him. Relieved that things had gone well, Ian confirmed it, even joking that he himself was a talisman of good fortune. Finally, Damon ordered him to stop talking, promising to overlook what had happened. He instructed Ian to return and keep his mouth shut. Ian agreed, assuring him of obedience while silently noting that he had passed the test. He knew Damon didn't believe every word, but that didn't matter. There was no need to rush. Ian politely excused himself, wishing Damon a good rest, and left. After Ian's departure, Damon picked up some documents. The only number he found was 974. Shocked at how blind the instructors seemed, he wondered if the evaluation system had failed or if something else was at play. Suddenly, he noticed something unusual written in Ian's records. Studying it closely, he smiled, admitting it was very interesting. A week later, the first exam for the special squad cadets began in the Blade Mountain Range. The Emperor had forbidden entry into the mountains, as the area was infested with deadly monsters.